Catus, Maximus here, this time with a little teardown of this old camera. It's like a 10-year-old Sony, although surprisingly enough, even this old 10-year-old pocket cameras, like 50 bucks on eBay. People just go really attached to these. A lot of people don't have the most modern smartphones. And I guess one argument for the pocket cameras is the big-time optical zoom. This thing's 10 years old, it's still 16 megapixels, 10 times optical zoom, optical image stabilization. Too bad I wouldn't put, won't turn on. Got even a new genuine Sony battery. Battery works fine. I was able to drive LEDs with it. Even went in there with a couple of probes to try to drive it. Thing won't turn on, so why not give it a little teardown? This will probably be highly destructive, but it's always kind of fun to get into these electronics. Look, they do use a metal quarter-inch thread for the mounting. But taking these things apart, it's, you know, pretty amazing. Even 10 years ago, actually a long time ago, cameras have always had just some of the tiniest of little parts. Tiny little screws, and it's just amazing how they can get, I mean, modern ones you can get with just 50 times zoom and hugely high resolution sensors. Those little screws are funky, so pop that off. And we have more tiny little screws. I think the biggest disadvantage to an old pocket camera like this, and why people should avoid them, is low battery life, that's for sure. And two, low resolution video. The big deal about that was not the sensor. Obviously a 16 megapixel sensor could, heck, that could shoot 4K video. It's just the processors hadn't reached enough power back then. And the ones that could process, you know, true 1080 or higher video, expensive and super power hungry. I will be keeping this lanyard though. That's a nice little lanyard. That's something that doesn't get outdated, these little lanyards. That is for sure. But it's an amazing puzzle. I think still the most amazing machines today are, I mean, there's some crazy complicated machines, but things like copying machines just have so much stuff that's inside them. It's just amazing they're able to engineer them. Kind of like engineering a whole factory or something. That's what every copying machine is. And cameras are kind of like that too. It's really kind of a demonstration of what can be done. That's for sure. You think about a cell phone, it doesn't really have, its complications are in all micro-manufactured parts, the motherboard and the camera sensors. But all the mechanics and the optics on these types of units are just pretty wild. Well, that wants to come off pretty easily that way. There we go. That's actually becoming a little bit more elegant. Oh, they did put little plastic covers over the buttons to help hold them together. Whoop. I'm trying to keep this in frame. I'm doing a terrible job. So, I didn't actually bother to go and look up any other videos to see if there were videos. This is all kind of figuring out a puzzle style. Let's try not using a flathead. Discovered that the screen will lift up, and there's another little screw hiding right back here. Really important to have high quality screwdrivers so that they really fit the screw. See how this one, every screw that I'm pulling out is getting stuck on the tip? That means it's sized really nicely. We have a ribbon cable right there. Sometimes you wonder how they even get this stuff together, to tell you the truth, because we've got one ribbon cable right here. There it goes. But there's another one. It's just folded on right there. You just wonder how they even got that thing attached. I think it's one of these little flips. We'll just do it that way. Nope, it wasn't a flip thing. So there's our little screen assembly and our button assembly all kind of as one unit there. We'll take this down to every piece. That is some kind of insulating sticker, some kind of little plastic separator that was sticky, and I'm trying to figure out how they held the buttons in there. There's a little clip on the bottom, and it's kind of like riveted, or there's two clips. Pop that clip. There we go. There's our button assembly. So that little ribbon cable is just for these tiny little buttons. Interesting that there is some kind of little chip. Maybe that's just a resistor or something. And the screen ribbon is taped down. There's like a little extra bit of insulation there. And then there's our little screen panel, all kind of integrated, a little metal back, kind of a modular unit. Surprisingly enough, for as much proprietary stuff that Sony does with all their products, it's the biggest gripe. Like on this camera, you either have to pull out the memory card to get the data off, or you got to have their special dock, but there is no standard USB port on this thing. It's like, ouch, Sony. We'll get to the most interesting part, the mechanics of the zoom lens, in a minute here. But I am trying to be elegant, not just smash this apart with a hammer. Tons of little screws. Actually, not that many. There's some cell phones that just have, you know, a quadrillion screws. Here's our motherboard with some little clippies. Why does it not want to come out yet? What else is it? There's another little... Let me look at this. This is where it's more cell phone-like, because you kind of wonder how they got those ribbons, this ribbon, but the ribbons on the back of it too. Those are not easy to assemble. You can get them unplugged well enough, but plugging them back in, that's a different story. And there's our little motherboard. Get those two wires off of there. Kind of surprising. Oh yeah, there's the big CPU for it. Really packed in, but look, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ribbon connectors on this one little board. Like, holy moly. As I continue fussing with it, this bottom piece comes off. I was wondering what those wires were. That's a tiny little speaker, I suppose, so you can listen to your videos or something like that. And then, surprisingly enough, it almost seems like, I mean, this lens assembly wants to come out of there, but not quite. I'm trying to figure out how to get the rest of this thing to cooperate. We got some more screws in there. Let's try getting those out. Anything else under here? Not really. Okay, so this is just... I was attached somehow. I don't really understand how, but it was. This is the memory card reader. Got another insulate. Oh, I see. It was caught under that. Oh, that's kind of interesting. There is a little permanently attached battery. I wonder if that has something to do with why the camera didn't work. I wonder why it's there. I wonder if it's just something to... I'm not sure, to tell you the truth. Maybe it's if the camera's main battery dies that you have this little one, or maybe That's what it's doing, is it's just they didn't have space on the motherboard, so this is just maintaining the settings or something like that. Pull that other big ribbon out. You can see just 2 terminals coming from the battery connector. So when I connected up a power supply directly to the positive and negative terminals, it did not, you know, the reason that didn't work wasn't because, oh no, there is a third wire. So maybe it's because it didn't detect a thermal sensor, but the battery is good, so don't really know what else to say. Trying to figure out the next step, and all I did was kind of pry this loose, and then the whole camera basically fell apart. So there's the whole assembly for the battery tray. This big thing is a high voltage capacitor, 315 volts, 79 microfarad, and that's what's helping drive the flash. Let's see if we can't get this top. Yeah, there is a little screw there, so maybe we can get this plastic cover off and look at the top buttons. To tell you the truth, for not having any instruction manual or any, you know, even looking at a video, just kind of fiddling my way through this, it's actually surprisingly, it's the modularity to make it cheaper to actually assemble in the plant, makes it relatively easy to also disassemble. This is the bright LED that helps the autofocus. This is an older camera, so it doesn't have, you know, laser autofocus or any of the other special stuff. Connector for that. And then this thing kind of pops out. We'll get this last screw apart here. It's actually kind of a big screw for a camera. That just is what holds in this piece. And then I suppose we can, if we wanted to, we could pull out the metal frame. But this is kind of neat. There is just all sorts of like little metal inserts and stuff in there. I think that helps. A lot of people comment that these cameras kind of feel solid for how small they are, and they actually have quite a bit of metal inside them. It's really surprising. So this is the little jog for the camera modes. Pretty robust. This is interesting. This is the actual shutter button. So the zoom is actually pushing this lever back and forth. Zoom in, zoom out, and then that's the neutral turn off position. And since this is a camera shutter switch, we actually got a light press. You can just see that. I can just feel that. And then a secondary hard press. That is an expensive little part to integrate the zoom and a 2-stage button. And then this right here is just the power button. Kind of neat. And now the lens assembly, which is its own entire separate assembly. And then here's the front of the camera. Got some more padding or something like that. Mold numbers. I wonder if it says what kind of plastic this is. No evidence of what kind of plastic it is. Anyway, now you've made it to the final part. There's our motor that controls the lens going in and out. There'll be a separate mechanism, a solenoid or something, that will control the autofocus. And then there'll be some magnets or something for the optical image stabilization. Definitely some complication here. So I removed every screw. There's a bunch of them. One under the ribbon cable, one to the side, some longer ones down here. And you think, I mean, that's a super fine ribbon cable. This is a super fine. This is the sensor. This entire other ribbon cable is just for lens control, like and autofocus. But there is the Sony 16 megapixel sensor. That's a neat little unit right there. Actually, that isn't the raw sensor. That's the sensor with a little glass lens over it. I bet we can really see the... That's some very brittle plastic. Wasn't soldered super well. So just popped the sensor right off the board. So there is our little sensor right there. Surprisingly enough, there's not that many connections. You think there'd be more for something that has the capability of seeing in 16 megapixels there. Let's get into the other part of the complication here. Well, we have some kind of spring there. And I don't know what this whole other section is. Some little... Oh, those are little finger sensors. So those are little, very tiny sensors that are sensing, probably sensing when it's opened and closed. This may, oh, we can see that. That's actually a motor. And this is a slider that moves something back and forth inside the lens itself. And then this was just some kind of, I believe, just tension spring. Not sure if that's part of the autofocus or the zoom, but what that motor did was move this little lens up and down. And oh, it probably retracts it all the way. That's how it compacts it. And then when the camera turns on, this comes out some and then adjusts itself as you're zooming. So that's kind of interesting. That's what that is a very, very tiny little step motor. And indeed, we have some more tiny screws right around through here. Before I get to that, this little gear drives that ring. Not sure how that totally works, but as the lens slides back and forth, this gear needs to make constant contact with this ring gear, so this gear is really tall. That's kind of interesting. And this is all kind of like one big integrated unit under here. That's just a piece of protective tape. Oh, that's like a sub cable, a sub ribbon cable, and a soldered. So this was just an extension cord. And then here is essentially the little gearbox with this little driven gear. So what this long gear was sitting in there. Let's try to get inside this thing. Just figuring out the puzzle. There's a little clip right here. Tiny little metal clip. And it looks like there's some more sensors for extents. This thing just peels open. And indeed it is. It's another little window sensor. How these work is something, it's just a little LED on one side and a receiver on the other side. This should have, I believe, 3 wires. Really hard to tell. Yeah, there's 3 wires. So anyway, when something passes through, it just breaks the beam and it lets it know it's turned on or off. Look at that little gearbox. We got a little worm drive, and then this transfer gear, 1, 2, 3, 4. And with this thing that was sitting in there, 5 transfer gears just to interact with this lens ring gear. That's kind of interesting. That's a lot of work and a lot of different gears just to be able to physically transmit mechanical power around that bend in the space that they had. And actually one of them was used as a RPM because there's this, it looks like a fan, but it's not. One of these little sensors was getting broken by this, so it was actually counting every 90 degrees the turns on the motor. Quite a bit of work just for a tiny little assembly like that. Anyway, let's get further into this. Alright, pushing on it, it actually all turns pretty smoothly. So that motor initially turns, and then there's a natural stop right there. And that natural stop, so it goes in. So this is when the camera's off. That's the camera on, and it does stop. And then as you zoom, this little bowl gear is extending the lens out, extending it in. So they're just getting everything to kind of fold and pancake, not fold, but just pancake on itself in order to cram so much lens in such a tiny little body. Found the optical image stabilization. So these are the 2 electromagnets, and they're working in conjunction to move this portion of the lens, and it uses just like one of those phone sensors. Come on now, focus. There we go. There we go. And so it kind of moves that up and down. That's the optical image stabilization. Quite a bit of movement in there, actually. Trying to figure out what other electronics, and this looks like it's the shutter that's hiding in there. Just a little bit of elbow grease and finger pressure, and I was able to pop the lens out of its housing. There's actually, for this assembly like this, or a molding, that is surprisingly rigid. That is actually really rigid. For something you would think is so brittle, that's actually pretty good plastic right there. Especially this dimension right here. Like, that's pretty good. Probably helps with overall camera stability. Now we can fiddle with the lens. So, not a lot left inside this to take apart. But still trying to dive deeper. I got to figure out how to get the rest of this apart. That wasn't too bad. I just had to turn a little bit more extreme to the left. We can see 3 little pegs. And this is just a collar. Actually, it's interesting that there are corrugations in there. And I think the reason those exist is because when you're on the long side of the zoom, it's to prevent reflections from this ring. Those reflections could cause ghosting on the image. So this is kind of like just the corrugations. What they're doing is so any light that comes in doesn't get reflected back towards the sensor and prevents ghosting. It's actually kind of an interesting touch. And then there's our primary lens. Did find a little lever right down in there, and that lever, when the lens retracts, is what opens and closes this little cover here. And if I activate it, come on now, we can actually see that it's metal. That's actually pretty nice. I'm surprised. I was kind of think it would just be entirely plastic. It's actually a metal lens cover. Not too bad. A little more fiddling around, and I was able to get this back piece just to pop out. What is interesting in this is that there's like multiple pieces. There appears to be like a shutter, but then there's this thing, which is like maybe for when it's really bright out, it automatically switches in this as a to reduce, so the camera doesn't get blinded. It gives it a better sensitivity in certain situations. I think that's kind of interesting. I'm going to knock that little screw out and see if we can't see what's inside here. That's going to be one tiny little screw. Yeah, it sure is. That's like an eyeglasses screw right there. You can barely see that thing. Let's see what we got inside here. Oh, we've got a little clippy there, a little clippy there. Just figuring out the design language, you know, where they like to do little clippies and things. Certainly can make it a lot easier. So this is actually black painted metal. And we can see our layers here. So there's that filter. And this, I believe, is our shutter. And those are actually plastic, super thin plastic. Makes them super lightweight. They can open and shut in an extremely small amount of time when you have something that flimsy and lightweight, that's for sure. So now we just have this part. Look at the pile of parts, and that's just from the lens assembly. This is the hardest part, it seems, is getting this last inner piece out. Like, it's really in there. This last piece is really too complicated. Look at that. We do have some rare earth magnets down there. They're not super strong, but they're also super tiny. And that must be for the autofocus. Oh no, that was part of the, so there are these rods that shift around. It's interesting because we have, where are those other electromagnets that I had? They're hiding somewhere. And that's what's hard to figure out, I guess. There we go. Oh, I see. Since these are on two different axes, I suspect that these are actually the optical image stabilization magnets, and then these are the autofocus magnets, and they're totally separate from each other. These microscopic little pins here that are actually captured, I guess, with pieces of glue. And I think that just about does it. These are strong once you get them onto a flat surface. They really hold on good. Oh, now they're stuck together. I'll never get them apart. There's a couple nice, neat magnets. Anyway, sorry for the super long video, but it's kind of like a puzzle in ways, is figuring out how to take apart things like this that just has so many pieces and parts. And actually, relatively speaking, I was pretty happy with myself. Just getting right down to these last parts in this really complicated lens assembly was difficult to figure out how to properly take it apart. But overall, heck, I'm pretty satisfied with my performance on this. Having not looked at any manuals and never been inside, I have hardly ever been inside any cameras, much like a Sony pocket camera like this. So it's kind of interesting that it just kind of leads you through. And quite frankly, you know, if Sony had made parts available, you could have replaced quite a bit of the stuff in this camera with relative ease. Kind of surprising, to tell you the truth. But man, huge amount of parts. Anyway, I really appreciate everybody who's been watching and subscribing. And if you haven't subscribed, please do. Till next time, Catus Maximus out.